There's a particular kind of friction that develops as the empath awakens, one that doesn't announce itself dramatically but accumulates quietly, conversation by conversation, gathering by gathering, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And that friction is this. The awakened empath has developed a profound, visceral intolerance for unconscious living. And this intolerance is about to change every relationship they have. Let me be precise about what I mean by unconscious living, because it's not about intelligence or education or even emotional awareness in its conventional sense. Analyze that first. In the next minute, unconscious living is the choice. And it is a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one, to move through life without examining it. To repeat patterns without curiosity about why they persist. To blame circumstances, other people, bad luck, the universe, anything external, rather than turning the lens inward and asking, what is my part in this? What am I not seeing? What is my part in this? What am I not seeing? What am I avoiding? The unconscious person isn't necessarily unkind or malicious. They might be warm, even loving in their way, but they're sleepwalking. They're running on automatic, driven by unexamined beliefs, unconscious patterns, inherited narratives they've never questioned. They suffer, often genuinely and deeply, but they refuse the invitation that suffering always carries. To wake up, to look, to examine what's actually happening. But to wake up, to examine what's actually happening beneath the surface. The awakened empath knows this territory intimately. Because they were there, they were unconscious too, perhaps more protected by their sensitivity than others, perhaps more aware of emotional undercurrents, but still fundamentally asleep to their own patterns, their own wounds, their own contributions to the dynamics they found themselves in. And then something happened. And then something happened. A crisis, a relationship that finally broke them open, a moment of clarity that couldn't be defended against. And they chose to wake up. Not just once, but repeatedly through the sustained, often agonizing work of becoming conscious, examining their childhood, confronting their shadows, taking radical responsibility for their choices, feeling the feelings they'd been numbing for years or decades. This was not easy. This was not comfortable. This was the hardest thing they've ever done, and they did it anyway. They chose consciousness over comfort, truth over the familiar anesthetic of denial, and now they exist in a different relationship to reality. They see patterns where others see isolated incidents. They recognize defenses where others see personality. They understand that suffering has roots that can be examined and addressed rather than just endured. They know that the life you have is significantly shaped by the story you tell about it, and that stories can be changed when you're willing to look at them honestly. And then they go to family dinner, or meet their old friends for drinks, or show up to the social gatherings they've always attended, and they encounter something that was always there but that they can now feel with unbearable clarity. Everyone is asleep. Everyone is running their patterns without examining them. Everyone is having the same conversations about the same problems they've had for years, with no curiosity about why nothing ever changes. The family member who's been in the same dysfunctional relationship for 15 years and talks about it every gathering but gets defensive when you suggest therapy. The friend who's perpetually broke but never examines their relationship with money or how their choices create their circumstances. The colleague who keeps getting passed over for promotion and insists it's because their boss doesn't like them, never considering what they might be contributing to the dynamic. These people aren't suffering less than the awakened empath. Often they're suffering more. But they've made a choice, conscious or not, to remain unconscious about the sources of their suffering. And the awakened empath, having done the work of becoming conscious, can no longer pretend not to see this, cannot pretend the patterns aren't there, cannot participate in conversations that circle suffering endlessly without ever touching its roots. This creates an almost unbearable tension, because the empath cares about these people. They can feel their pain with that characteristic depth and sensitivity. They can see, often quite clearly, what would actually help, the patterns that need examining, the beliefs that need questioning, the choices that need changing, the choices that need changing. And they have to sit with the knowledge that pointing any of this out will be met with resistance, defensiveness, or outright hostility, because unconscious people don't experience the awakened empath's clarity as helpful. They experience it as threatening. And it is threatening to their comfortable narratives, to their preferred explanations, to the defensive structures they've built to avoid looking at themselves. The awakened empath's very presence becomes uncomfortable because consciousness is contagious, and unconscious people can feel when someone around them has stopped agreeing to remain asleep. So they pull away from each other. The awakened empath finds these gatherings increasingly draining, increasingly painful, increasingly impossible to endure without betraying either their truth or their compassion. And the unconscious people find the awakened empathy increasingly strange, judgmental, too much, no longer the person they used to know. And they're right. The empath is no longer the person they used to know. They've woken up, and you cannot maintain deep, genuine connection across the chasm between consciousness and unconscious living. You can love someone who chooses to stay asleep, but you cannot stay in their dream with them. Now, alongside this intolerance for unconscious living, there's another profound transformation happening in the awakened empath that most people around them completely misunderstand. And this one is perhaps the most personally revolutionary of all. The empath's relationship with solitude has fundamentally changed, and this change is quietly dismantling their entire social architecture. To understand the significance of this shift, you need to understand what solitude meant to the unhealed empath. It was something to be avoided, managed, filled. The empath who hasn't yet done their healing work experiences solitude as dangerous territory. Being alone means being with yourself. And for someone who's been absorbing everyone else's emotions, managing everyone else's needs, defining themselves through their usefulness to others, being with yourself is terrifying because you don't quite know who that self is. So the unhealed empath fills every silence. They're always available, always responding, always engaged with someone else's world. They take on other people's problems because focusing on yours keeps you from feeling your own emptiness. They maintain a constant stream of relational engagement because the alternative, stillness, silence, genuine solitude, feels like confronting a void they're not equipped to face. This pattern creates a particular kind of dependency on others, not just emotional dependency, but existential dependency. Other people become the way the unhealed empath knows they exist, the way they feel real, the way they understand who they are. Without constant relational engagement, they feel they might dissolve, disappear, cease to matter, and this dependency is what makes the empath so vulnerable to unhealthy relationships. When your sense of self depends on being needed, on being in relation, on constant engagement with others, you'll accept almost any relationship rather than face the alternative and face the alternative. You'll tolerate being treated badly because bad relationship feels preferable to no relationship. You'll fill your life with shallow connections because shallow connection seems better than the terrifying openness of genuine solitude. Then comes the awakening. And part of that awakening, often the most surprising part, is the discovery of what solitude actually is when you're genuinely present to it. Not the terror of being alone with an undefined, unexamined self, but the profound experience of being with a self you've come to know, accept, and even cherish. The awakened empath has done the work of meeting themselves through therapy, through meditation, through journaling, through the sustained practice of turning inward rather than outward. For orientation, they've developed a relationship with their own interior that they never had before. They know who they are. They know what they think and feel and value and need. They know the landscape of their own psyche in ways they never did when they were constantly absorbed in others. And this knowing transforms solitude from threat into sanctuary. The empath discovers that their own company is extraordinary. The empath discovers that their own company is extraordinary, that their inner world is rich and complex and fascinating and nourishing, that they can spend hours, even days, in genuine solitude and emerge, not depleted but renewed, not hollow but full, not lonely but deeply accompanied by themselves. This is a revolution, because when solitude becomes sacred rather than terrifying, when your own company becomes genuinely safe, efficient, rather than something you're desperately escaping, the entire calculus of your social life changes. You're no longer choosing relationships from scarcity, from the desperate need to fill silence, to avoid yourself, to outsource your sense of reality and worth to others. You're choosing from abundance, from a place of already being full, already being grounded, already having everything you fundamentally need within yourself. And this changes your standards dramatically. Because when you no longer need company to feel real or worthy or safe, you need company to actually nourish you. You need relationships that add something genuine to a life that's already meaningful. You need connections that offer real depth, real reciprocity, real meeting between two whole people. Because anything less isn't worth leaving your sanctuary for. This is when the empath looks around at their existing relationships and realizes most of these were chosen from scarcity. Most of these people are in my life not because they genuinely enrich it, but because I needed bodies in the room, voices on the phone, proof that I existed and mattered. I was using them to avoid myself as much as they were using me for whatever I provided. And now that the empath no longer needs to avoid themselves, now that solitude has become nourishing rather than threatening, they simply stop showing up to relationships that don't offer something more valuable than what they already have in their own company. This seems cruel from the outside. People feel abandoned, deprioritized, replaced. But the empath isn't choosing loneliness over relationship. They're choosing genuine solitude over the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who don't actually see or know or nourish you. Because here's what most people don't understand. The loneliest experience isn't being alone. It's being in a room full of people who don't know you, maintaining relationships that were never built on genuine meeting, performing connection while actually starving for it. The awakened empath has chosen to step out of that particular loneliness. They've discovered that real solitude, genuine conscious, chosen time with themselves, is less lonely than most of the relationships they've been maintaining. And when you finally discover that your own company is profound, you stop accepting shallow connection as a substitute for genuine solitude. Now there's another dimension to the awakened empath's outgrowing that's particularly painful, not just personally but relationally, because it involves the systems they belong to. The family systems, the friend groups, the communities, the cultural narratives. And the awakened empath has developed an ability they cannot switch off. They can see the collective denial that holds these systems together, and they can no longer participate in it. Let me explain what collective denial looks like. Because it's so normalized within systems that it becomes almost invisible to those in systems, that it becomes almost invisible to those inside it. Every family, every friend group, every community has its unspoken agreements, its shared version of reality that everyone maintains through mutual silence. The things everyone knows but no one says. The patterns everyone sees but no one names. The dysfunctions everyone experiences, but everyone agrees to explain away, minimize, or simply never acknowledge. In families, this might look like everyone knows dad has a drinking problem, but no one talks about it directly. Everyone knows mom's criticism is actually contempt, but it gets called, she just wants the best for you. Everyone knows the marriage is broken, but the family narrative is, they have their issues, but they love each other. Everyone knows certain topics are dangerous, but the rule is we don't talk about that in tea. His family. In friend groups, it might look like everyone knows. The dynamic is built on gossip, on tearing down others to feel better collectively. Everyone knows. The group has a hierarchy where some people's needs consistently override others. Everyone knows certain members are being treated badly, but the unspoken rule is solidarity over honesty. Everyone knows the group's shared narrative about an outsider or an ex is one-sided, but challenging it means becoming the next target. These collective denials serve a function. They maintain the system's stability. As long as everyone agrees not to see certain things, as long as everyone maintains the shared fiction, the system can continue. The family can keep functioning. The friend group can keep gathering. The community can keep cohering. Around its shared identity. But the awakened empath has broken through their own denial systems. They've done the work of seeing clearly their own patterns, their own contributions, their own blind spots. And this capacity for honest seeing doesn't turn off when they're in a room with their family or their old friends. They see the collective denial with the same clarity they've developed for seeing their own. And they can no longer pretend, they can no longer sit at the family table and act like the dynamics are healthy when they can feel the dysfunction radiating from every interaction. They can no longer participate in friend group conversations that tear others down while maintaining the fiction that it's just venting. They can no longer validate narratives they know to be distorted, enable patterns they can see are destructive, enable patterns they can see are destructive, or maintain silences that protect dysfunction at the expense of truth. This makes them enormously threatening to these systems, because collective denial only works when everyone participates. One person who refuses to pretend, one voice that names what everyone is working hard not to see. This destabilizes the entire system. It threatens the shared fiction that holds everything in place. And systems under threat respond with pressure. The family member who names the dysfunction gets labeled the problem one, the difficult one, the one who always has to make things complicated. The friend who refuses to participate in collective gossip gets accused of being disloyal, judgmental, too good for us now. The community member who questions the shared narrative gets pushed to the margins or out entirely. The awakened empath faces a choice in every system they belong to. Continue participating in collective denial to maintain belonging, or refuse the denial and face the consequences. And having done the work of breaking through their own denial, having experienced what clarity and honesty make possible, they find they simply cannot choose the first option anymore. The cost to their integrity is too high. This is deeply painful, because these systems often include people they love. Parents, siblings, lifelong friends, communities that shaped them. Breaking the collective denial doesn't mean they stop loving these people, but it does mean they can no longer maintain the intimacy that collective denial provides, the false closeness that comes from sharing the same blind spots, maintaining the same fictions, agreeing not to see the same things, And here's what the awakened empath discovers. Most people would rather maintain the denial than examine what the denial is protecting. Most people would rather keep the shared fiction intact than face the discomfort of seeing clearly. Most people will choose the stability of the system, however dysfunctional, over the terrifying freedom that comes with honest seeing. So the empath finds themselves increasingly unable to belong to the systems they came from. Not because in the next minute, you rejected these people, but because genuine belonging in these systems requires a blindness they've permanently shed. You cannot unsee the collective denial once you've seen it, and you cannot maintain closeness with people whose connection depends on you pretending to be blind. And now we arrive at one of the most practically significant shifts in the awakened empath's relational life, one that fundamentally restructures not just who they're willing to be in relationship with, but what they're willing to accept from those relationships, because the awakened empath has developed non-negotiable standards for reciprocity. And this single shift reveals something sobering about almost every relationship they've been maintaining. Let me explain why this particular shift is so transformative by first understanding what the unhealed empath's relationship to reciprocity actually was. The unhealed empath didn't just give generously. They gave without requirement of return. They absorbed others' emotions, provided endless support, showed up consistently, invested deeply. And they did all of this without any internal structure that said, this must flow both ways. This wasn't generosity in its truest sense. Genuine generosity includes self-respect, the understanding that your resources are valuable and should be exchanged in ways that honor that value. What the unhealed empath practiced was something different. Compulsive giving driven by the belief that requiring reciprocity was selfish, that demanding anything in return would make them unworthy of love, that their value in relationships came from what they provided rather than who they were. So they gave and gave and gave, and the people in their life received and received and received. Not necessarily with malicious intent, many of them simply adjusted to the dynamic that was presented. The empath set a standard. I will give without requiring return. And the people around them, being human, accepted that standard. They took the support, absorbed the emotional labor, received the consistent investment, and gave back whatever they felt like giving, which was often considerably less. And the empath told themselves this was okay. They called it unconditional love. They called it being good friend, a devoted partner, a loyal family member. But what it actually was self-abandonment disguised as virtue. Then came the awakening, and with it, a recognition that changed everything. The way I've been giving is not love. It's self-erasure. And the relationships I've been maintaining are not genuine connections. They're arrangements that only survive because I've never required them to be anything more. The awakened empath develops what we might call relational self-respect, the understanding that their time, energy, emotional availability, and care are genuinely valuable resources that deserve to be exchanged in ways that honor their worth. They begin to require presence from the people they're present for, effort from the people they put effort into, consistency from the people they put effort into, consistency from the people they show up for consistently, genuine interest in who they are from the people they're genuinely interested in. These aren't excessive demands. These are the basic requirements of mutual relationship. But because the empath has never required them before, they feel new and uncomfortable, both to the empath and to everyone in their life. And here's what happens when they start requiring reciprocity. Most people simply won't meet the standard. Not because they're incapable. Some of them are genuinely capable. Some of them are genuinely capable of reciprocity in other relationships. But because with the empath specifically, they've been conditioned to receive without giving. The dynamic has been established. The pattern has been set, and changing it fails to them, like the empath suddenly moving the goalposts, suddenly becoming difficult, suddenly wanting too much. The friend who's always called the empath for support but never asked how they're doing will experience the empath's new requirement for reciprocal interest as neediness. The family member who's always received the empath's emotional labor without providing any in return will experience the empath's new boundaries as coldness. The partner who's always had the empath's unconditional presence without providing consistent emotional availability will experience the empath's new standards as unreasonable demands. But the awakened empath now sees these responses clearly. They recognize that what's actually being revealed is the transactional reality of these relationships. They were built on the empath's self-abandonment, and they cannot survive the empath's self-abandonment, and they cannot survive the empath's self-respect. The moment the empath requires something genuine in return, the relationship collapses, which tells you everything about what the relationship actually was. Because genuinely caring people who were invested in the relationship, rather than just in what the empath provided, would respond to the empath's new requirements with willingness. They would say, in effect, you're right. I should have been asking how you're doing. I should have been showing up for you the way you've been showing up for me. They would rise to meet the new standard because the relationship matters to them beyond what they were extracting from it. The people who can't meet the standard of basic reciprocity were never truly invested in the empath as a person, only in the empath as a resource. And the awakened empath as a resource. And the awakened empath, having developed the clarity to see this distinction, can no longer pretend otherwise. So the outgrowing continues, not because the empath has become demanding or difficult, but because they've finally begun requiring what healthy relationship actually requires: mutual investment, mutual presence, mutual care. And most of their existing relationships were never built to provide that. When you finally require from others what you've always freely given, you discover which relationships were connections and which were simply arrangements. And finally, we arrive at perhaps the most quietly revolutionary shift of all, the one that operates beneath all the others, that makes every other aspect of the awakened empath's transformation possible, that represents the most fundamental change in how they move through the world. The awakened empath has stopped outsourcing their sense of reality to others. They've developed what I want to call epistemic sovereignty, the ability to trust their own knowing. And in the next minute, and this single shift is dissolving relationships that were built, often invisibly, on the empath's self-doubt. Let me explain what I mean by epistemic sovereignty, because this concept is central to understanding why this shift is so transformative and why it's so threatening to the people around the empath. Epistemic sovereignty is the capacity to trust your own perceptions, your own experiences, your own interpretations of reality, without requiring external validation to confirm that what you're experiencing is real, that what you're perceiving is accurate, that what you know is actually true. It's the ability to say, I know what I experienced, without needing someone else to agree before you'll believe yourself behind. The unhealed empath has almost none of this. Their entire relational history has involved other people's realities being treated as more valid than their own. In childhood, perhaps, their perceptions were consistently overridden by adults who told them what they were really feeling, what was really happening, what things really meant. They learned to dist as their own knowing and defer to others' interpretations. This made them extraordinarily vulnerable to manipulation. When someone told them their memory was wrong, they believed it. When someone insisted their feelings were unreasonable, they accepted it. When someone reframed their experience to serve a different narrative, they deferred to that reframing. They outsourced their sense of reality so completely that they lost confidence in their ability to know anything reliably about their own experience. And this vulnerability, this epistemic insecurity, was the foundation on which many of their relationships were built. Not just the explicitly abusive ones, but many ordinary ones too. Friends whose influence depended on the empath deferring to their judgments. Family members whose authority depended on the empath not trusting their own perceptions. Partners whose control depended on the empath's willingness to accept their version of events. Willingness to accept their version of events. Then comes the awakening. An essential part of that awakening is the reclamation of epistemic authority. Through therapy, through self-inquiry, through the sustained practice of checking in with their own knowing. Rather than immediately seeking external confirmation, the empath begins to trust themselves. They begin to recognize that their perceptions are valid data about reality, that their experiences happened and matter regardless of whether others validate them, that their knowing is trustworthy even when others dispute it. This is profoundly liberating, but it's also profoundly destabilizing to the people who've been benefiting from the empath self-doubt. Because the moment the empath stops needing consensus to trust their perception, all the manipulation that depended on that need becomes ineffective. The gaslighting doesn't land anymore, because the empath trusts their own memory over someone else's revision. The sake, eel pressure doesn't move them anymore, because they don't need group agreement to feel confident in their position. The disapproval that used to send them into anxious self-questioning no longer has the same power because they've developed enough self-trust to remain steady even when others disagree. And this steadiness, this calm confidence in their own knowing, is experienced by others as arrogance, as stubbornness, as the empath thinking they're always right. But that's a misreading. The awakened empathist isn't claiming infallibility. They're not insisting their perspective is the only valid one. They're simply no longer collapsing in the face of others' disagreement. They're no longer abandoning their own perception the moment someone pushes back. This has a particular effect on relationships that were built on the empath's epistemic insecurity. These relationships often had an implicit dynamic. The empath would have a perception or experience. The other person would challenge or reframe it, and the empath would defer. This gave the other person enormous power, the power to define reality, to shape the empath's understanding of events, to control the narrative. When the empath stops deferring, this dynamic collapses. And people who are accustomed to this power often respond with escalating pressure. They push harder for the empath to accept their version of reality. But when they accuse the empath of being inflexible, difficult, closed-minded, they might even become aggressive in their attempts to restore the old dynamic where their interpretation of reality was automatically privileged over the empath's. But the awakened empath holds steady. They can hear others' perspectives, can genuinely consider them, can update their understanding when presented with compelling information. But they no longer automatically defer. They no longer treat others' certainty as evidence that they themselves must be wrong. They've learned that confident assertion is not the same as truth. That insistence is not the same as truth. That insistence is not the same as accuracy. That someone's emotional intensity in claiming something doesn't make their claim valid. This epistemic sovereignty is perhaps the deepest form of the empath outgrowing, because it's not just about specific relationships. It's about a fundamental shift in how they relate to their own knowing. Because it's of a fundamental shift in how they relate to their own knowing, they've become the authority on their own experience. Not the only authority on their own experience. Not the only authority on objective reality, but the primary authority on what they've perceived, felt, and lived through. And the relationships that cannot survive this, the ones that depended on the empath's self-doubt, that required their epistemic insecurity to function, these relationships are incompatible with who the empath has become. They were built on a foundation that no longer exists. When you finally trust your own knowing, every relationship built on your self-doubt quietly loses its foundation. And the people who needed you, uncertain, discover they have no power over someone who is finally certain of themselves.